check, we've done it. It's actually an ongoing series of methods done with that money and put in place for future investments, these incremental, opportunistic times to do everything you do a little better and smarter and use the same money, but make it do more to achieve this goal. But people have to be clear about what the goal is, including the fact that the goalpost is moving over time. So that there's this sense that we have to not just plan one thing one way, but plan things with this adaptability to handle the unforeseen. You know, there's the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, and resilience does a really good job at handling the factors of surprise. So actually, a lot of this parallels things like military doctrine and you know, modern defense strategy. So it's kind of interesting to be in the room with some of the senior folks with Army Corps taking that type of thinking.
Yeah, you're planning in the face of uncertainty.
And you better act fast, because that's the time frame that's pressing on us.
Right.
And so they're now actually really there's a lot of research and practice going on right now to really define what this resilient approach means and how can you tell. When FEMA comes in, they've often almost caused problems by saying, you need to put that bridge back exactly that way. No, 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 we can tell you're doing something a little fancier and you say it's smarter, but we just think you're trying to, you know, put a little pork in your barrel. We're not going to let you. So,
yeah, so I'm going to take this to a little bit, this notion of doing the cost-benefit analysis and, you know, the kind of the inherent uncertainty of the risk assessment and to the building level, the building owner level. Building or property owner level. You know, Nick, you're in the midst of a project on a 12-acre waterfront site. What's your total development cost there?
$225 million.
$225 million project. How, in your project pro forma, how do you think about the question of whether to spend extra cost for flood protection, let's just call it that, for climate resilience, as against some uncertain future risk? How do you, I mean, you're clearly doing that, so what's your methodology for thinking about that?
So part of it is the approach that we take as Lend Lease. You know, our mantra is create the best places, right? So we're trying to deliver an experience on the waterfront that's worthy of the site that we're operating on. And so every decision is a cost benefit, but and we also look at the promise of the waterfront experience and the tension between resiliency and buffering from the actions of Boston Harbor and the access and recreation and education available to people who interact with the harbor. So we're doing something a little bit unique in our project that hasn't been done in the urban core before. We're creating a natural living shoreline. We're introducing recreation. We're introducing opportunities to interact with the waterfront that aren't just behind bollards and chains like a lot of the Harbor Walk experience, but that really feature access and education and the ability to you know, dip your toes in and turn over seaweed and look for crabs and, you know, all of the things that make interacting with the waterfront important and special. And so how do you finance that? Part of it
are you looking for special sources of funding for that, or are you just assuming
no,
that the market is going to reward that expenditure?
So that's you hope and you pray, given the and I'll call them handcuffs, but there are a set of parameters that you need to design to on the waterfront that are influenced by Chapter 91 and municipal harbor plans and East Boston master plans and height limitations and limitations that we impose on ourselves with our product types, building to the right economy for the location. And so the short answer is yes, we're banking on the experience that we can deliver to be economically viable and to be able to fund the improvements we are seeking to make to deliver the experience.
Do you need a density bonus to do this?
It would be great to have density bonuses, height bonuses, all kinds of bonuses, right? But that's balanced against what you can deliver in terms of unit counts for apartments and condominium sell-throughs and all of that. And even if there were bonuses, the parameters on the site wouldn't really allow us to take advantage of them, because delivering extra height, for instance, it seems like an easy lever to pull, but we'd be building within the parameters of the municipal harbor plan, so only up to 86 feet, which means we're building into economic no man's land for steel and concrete construction, whereas if we build 70 feet or below, we can deliver a product that fits the market dynamic in East Boston and the demand we want to create. So yeah, I mean, it would be great to have more tools in the toolkit, JIF as an example, to help defray some of the increment of cost that we're using to not only be resilient, but to create the experience
Right.
in water.
But at this point, you're doing it without those tools. Laura, I want to ask you a question in a minute, but before I do, this reminds me a little bit of Jamie's comment about Lower Manhattan and land creation, land reclamation. Rather than a density bonus going up, you're basically creating new land and using the value of that land to fund the improvements farther inland. How's that working? Or is it too early to tell?
Do you mean Nick doing that, or?
No, I'm asking you about New York.
We're actually giving land back. We're creating more
Yeah.
water sheet with our
Yes.
project, which is a kind of unusual circumstance.
Yeah, no, I'm asking you whether, you were using it in a different context. It's not exactly a density bonus, but you're using the enhanced development value of that land reclamation, right, to pay for the improvements.
Yeah, I mean.
So is it working?
Well, not yet. I mean, it's a radical, it's one of the more radical ideas that, in one way, that came out of the post-Sandy planning. I mean, the sort of, I think you have to start a few steps back. A lot of this city and New York and many other cities, was built on fill. And, you have a sort of circumstance where people often get confused and think that fill is just fundamentally more subject to flooding when there's risk, but it's not. It's just the level of the edge that gets created. And when we built our cities through fill, we were still a maritime industrial city, so we built the edge very low for access by boats. We have an instance in New York where that's not the case. On the west side of Manhattan, a place called Battery Park City, which was built in the 70s and 80s from the excavation of the original World Trade Center. And because that maritime industrial era had passed, the edge of Battery Park City is high enough that it is the one place that didn't flood in Lower Manhattan during Sandy. The water was just stopped by that higher edge. So the concept that is right there is to do that on the East River. And again, it's all within a typology. So it's sort of looking around and saying, okay, I have a substantial amount of property that's at risk in this location. Well, do I have any value at that location that I can leverage? And so in that case, the idea is to build out into the river and leverage the value of new land that gets created and the development rights that get created on top of it, which, is sort of an incremental financing concept. The short answer to your question is, there's a feasibility study that's been done. There's been discussions with the state and federal regulators, but the city has pushed it off and has decided to focus on more immediate protection and leave this for a fight for a couple of years from now when they have a little more room on their plate.
Yeah. Although maybe now's the time to do it, the mayor, in the election cycle anyway. Would you want to do that early in your term? So
I believe so, and given that he can probably create 7,500 units of affordable housing, which is what he really wants to do, I think he should, but nobody listens to me.
Laura, we've talked about how difficult it is to sort of quantify the costs that we're avoiding here in our cost-benefit analysis. They certainly exist. We also talked about the fact that there really aren't specific financing programs tailored to climate resilience. Should existing financing programs take this into account? Would it be, if you have a whole range of tools you use at MassDevelopment. They're mostly, your mission is economic development, and you measure that. I'm sure you have ways that you measure that. When you're deciding whether to make a tool available, whether it's to a private nonprofit or for-profit developer, you need to show that economic development benefits justify the use of that tool. Should you be, is there a way to incorporate climate resilience into your scorecards on existing programs so we don't have to invent new ones?
I think that should be a question more for the lending community as a whole. that would make something attractive to a building owner versus not, based on their potential avoided costs. There are, I always did speak to the PACE statute, which is something that lets people take, you know, an off-balance sheet method of financing via a special tax assessment, and that could definitely be used for resiliency. You'd still need willing owners wanting to do this, but it would be a cheaper and less financially uncomfortable way for them to borrow. And at some point, I think, you know, as there does become an increased sense of risk, it becomes an underwriting concern for any lender whose primary collateral is the asset that they're financing, and then potential losses become a very real concern for them as they appraise what that building might be worth over the course of the 25 or so years that their debt will be outstanding. So at some point, the market will require.
Do you see lenders doing that now, when they're
No.
lending on coastal properties? Do you see them pushing this
No,
now?
no.
So I want to open this up to the audience in a minute. I want to ask you all, you know, one kind of overarching question. Who should pay for this? Should it be the people affected, or should it be everybody? How widely should we socialize the cost of climate resilience?
Who wants to take that?
I can take a crack at this because I think everyone's really aware when Katrina bore down on greater New Orleans and the whole region down there, especially New Orleans, people said, I've been down there, that's the dumbest place to have a city. Now that it's largely rendered incapacitated, now would be a good time to just move everybody out, do something different, show people the path of the future. And there's logic to that. Some of the shortcomings have to do with looking at the major export contributions of grain and et cetera coming down the Mississippi River and out of the port of New Orleans. If you didn't have all of that capacity, what does that do to balance of trade, food pricing around the world, global security, all these other things. So the decision was made, well, we're going to basically, you know, plug that hole in the local economy to feed the regional, national, and international economies. But then the question was, can it be done in a way that allows us to view a city and a region like Greater New Orleans and see it as a canary in a coal mine, see what they faced and take some measures, put some methods in place, put some physical examples in place that might have some merit for replicability elsewhere. And I think they did that. And I also think the way that was done, there was a lot of perimeter infrastructure to keep water out of the region. They made that better, they added new links in the chain, they really expanded this idea of multiple lines of defense, and part of that was all of the building code, all of the evacuation protocols, all the improvements to the power grid and the water infrastructure, the water supply, wastewater, things like that. So, and that they're spending every public and private investment over the next decades better informed and in strategic alignment with this new vision, but keeping the water out during that period made it possible for people to reinvest. So everything they're doing behind the perimeter control, they're not just like go back and do things the way you were, only maybe worse, since now you have a better system around you. They see it as keeping the water out for, you know, New Orleans is one of the older cities in the country, so they do think more long-term in some places. And they see this giving them a new,
So
a
you're okay
second
with,
time.
federal, with broadly spreading the cost of
No, I
protecting
say
New
there's a
Orleans?
particular case that happens to very clearly apply to New Orleans. I think for similar reasons, New York City is quite a hub that can have similar expanded economic impacts and justify it. I wouldn't say that every place justifies.
Fair enough. So who else wants to weigh in here?
Yeah, and you know, my answer is sort of, I think, supportive of where Wendy's going, is that, and I may have sort of said it already, but I think there are two distinct logics to apply in making decisions about what to build. The first logic is the logic of financeability, which is I'm looking at an asset, the asset is at risk. Is it rational for me to make an investment in making that asset less at risk? based on the improvement in asset value? And if so, I should use a portion of the improvement in that asset value to finance the improvement, which is sort of what we're talking about. And, you know, Nick has a pro forma in which it is rational for him to, he hopes, for him to make these interventions because there's enough value there that he can still make more money, even though he's made these interventions. And so in that first logic, you know, you take in many places, New Orleans as a whole, right? Boston, New York. I mean, it's just, there is more value here than, you know, than would be, you don't want to leave all that value on the table. So that's logic one. In the cases where the answer is no, then you're in public policy logic. And so that's where you're saying, do I have vulnerable populations? You know, in New York in 2050, we'll have 850,000 people living in the 100-year floodplain. You know, many of those people live in public housing or have income below median. They're not making a choice to live in those places, and many of them are vulnerable. So you have to make a decision based on public policy logic. Do I make an investment that will not be supportable by the incremental value that's created? And there are many cases where we're doing that, and I think Wendy's talked about one of them. New Orleans is just too important.
Yeah.
So we make that investment, and that's why we have state and federal governments.
Yeah, so I feel slightly disadvantaged relative to this question about who should pay as a real estate developer, because no one likes to give real estate developers handouts. But I do think there are a couple of things. One is, you know, the hope is not to be penalized for making good decisions. And if we choose to be a 100-year project rather than a 50-year project, as the FEMA, you know, proposed floodplain elevations would suggest, we should be able to make that decision and then have the follow-on decisions relative to height and other improvements not penalize us for being good citizens. The other piece of that, and you touched on it, Jamie, is if we are being required to implement resilient strategies at the water's edge or other places in our site, that may be an instance where a program similar to iCubed for infrastructure or other things are available to help absorb that site premium. Because I'll tell you that we have a fairly substantial site premium on our site due to the nature of the site, but also due to our own decisions. And so our decisions are our decisions to create a place that we think is marketable and saleable and advantageous, not just for our residents, but the whole of East Boston and all of the people who want to interact with the waterfront. You know, I would expect to absorb those costs, but if there are opportunities from a regulatory standpoint that are for improvements that are being pushed onto us unwillingly, then I would think that it would be prudent to also have a source of funding.
Laura, anything you want to add to this?
Just that I think the issue drives some of our classic issues around infrastructure and who should pay. And on the public side, is it the city or the state or the federal government? When we put together the iCubed program, it was because of the issue of cities bearing the cost of maintaining the public infrastructure, but not receiving really what was most of the economic upside of the projects, which was increased income taxes at the state level. So there is an opportunity to think about, are we retaining income for the state perhaps that needs to then be funneled back into infrastructure programs at the city, or is that income that really would not be foregone, but it just be moved somewhere else? So I think thinking about what would happen but for improved infrastructure lets us get a sort of handle on where we can allocate those costs to where the benefits are really going.
So let me throw it over to the audience. You can, if you have general questions, that's fine too. If you want to direct them to one panelist in particular, feel free to do that as well, right here.
I noticed on one of the slides, I think it was the New York slide, it said that there was a regulation that suggested that the FEMA elevation be raised by 1 to 2 feet.